Hi, I'm Heather. I'm a student at the University of Derby, and I'll be discussing my research, which explores the ideological reasons behind the destruction of the Temple of Baal in Syria. So I'll break it down into three sections with the aim of arguing throughout that it is fundamental to try to understand the ideological motivations influencing the destruction of Syrian world heritage. The first section will explore and critique how the term iconoclasm has been used, before moving on to making connections between colonialism and Syrian heritage. Then the paper will discuss how identity conflicts link to the destruction of heritage, different levels, and then the last section builds on these segments to look at how international responses have fueled further destruction of heritage, before speculating on what more appropriate international responses would look like. So, for context then, Palmyra is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the Temple of Baal is around 2,000 years old. It hasn't been used for religious purposes in around 1,500 years, and the god who was worshipped there has been associated with the Greek god Zeus. ISIS originally said they would not destroy the Temple of Baal among other Greco-Roman ruins in Palmyra, but they not only destroyed it, but documented the process of destruction, as these images show before, during, and after the process. It led some commentators to argue that when ISIS destroy monuments like this, it's for propaganda fodder and to entice new recruits. They don't see any value in the monuments themselves. However, I'm going to argue that there are deep-rooted ideological reasons for destruction of monuments like this, associated with both Syrian history and the political situation. So, in this first section, I'll be talking about how the term iconoclasm has been used to explain the violence, but that it's really only the tip of the iceberg. An iconoclasm then can be defined as religiously motivated violence targeted at icons, symbols, and monuments in order to intimidate the people who follow that religion. But just using this term is not useful. One newspaper article grouped ISIS' current destruction of heritage with other iconoclasms from different time periods and different locations, and it suggested that these were all united by both war and religion, without acknowledging the different contexts for these acts of violence. F.B. Flood picks up on this issue when he discusses how people framed the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas by the Taliban, and that commentators often group together this act of destruction in a group with all other so-called Muslim iconoclasms, as if to suggest they were just a feature of the Muslim religion. But as Flood points out, Muslims had lived alongside the Bamiyan Buddhas for millennia. And so he argues that there are other factors influencing the destruction of heritage, such as the politics, for example. And when the Bamiyan Buddhas were destroyed, it attracted global media attention. Flood also argues that so-called iconoclasms can be organised bureaucratic processes, and I think this is supported by the fact that ISIS have an antiquities division responsible for tasks such as research and excavation, and this shows that their approach to heritage then is really quite organised. It's not just a mindless bit of iconoclasm, as one newspaper described. I think it's important then to move on to look at the history of Palmyra, to uncover some of the reasons why particular monuments might be problematic. So Palmyra is an ancient city. It's known worldwide for its Greco-Roman ruins, and it was a trading outpost of the Roman Empire. It was largely forgotten until the 17th century when European merchants rediscovered the city. It became particularly popular in the 19th century when European archaeologists carried out excavations across the region of Syria and Iraq in order to fill Western museums with ancient objects. Many of these archaeologists had colonial ambitions, such as Gertrude Bell, who was responsible for drawing up the new artificial borders of Iraq just after World War I, which then later influenced the new artificial borders of Syria in 1920. So, as you can see from the map, parts of Syria and Iraq used to be part of the same region called Mesopotamia until they were then created into separate nation states. Mayer argues that this concept of the nation state is something which is characteristic of the late 19th century. It's a European concept, and it's also imperialist in nature, as these European countries intended the new nation states to be extensions of their own. And May points out that in nation states, no point is outside the control of these new boundaries. But he points out that imposing the concept of a nation state can be problematic because it's imposing a Western idea onto a population which is not necessarily in acceptance of this or even acknowledges this concept. And it relates to ISIS ideology in the sense that they are now trying to establish their own Islamic region, which just rejects this Western notion of the nation state. So, in response to this colonial presence in the Middle East, a Sunni Islam rebel group was formed called the Salafists. And they felt that Middle Eastern societies were beginning to imitate Western ways, and their ideas amounted in spectacles of destruction. Historians like Campion and De Cesare have argued that you can trace both Taliban and ISIS back to these 19th century Salafists, especially in terms of ideology. But this argument is both teleological and reductive. As the diagram shows here, there are a few different branches of Salafism, two of which are not associated with terrorism. So it's not enough to just use this umbrella term of Salafist in order to trace back their ideology. And also there are other factors which have influenced ISIS ideology. All the intervening events between the 19th century Salafists and now. So Syria's formation as an independent so-called nation state, and also the current conflict. Macris wrote an article which supports this argument. He points out that you can also associate ISIS ideology with an earlier form of Salafism called Wahhabism. This was around the 18th century, and that newspapers have overstated these links between these older ideologies and ISIS today, and that their hatred of what they call the modern European imperialists is not related to Wahhabism. So This research isn't useful to point, it helps to paint part of a picture in terms of explaining ISIS ideology, but it doesn't offer enough of a comprehensive explanation. We really need to try to understand all the different influences in order to offer a detailed explanation for why heritage monuments like the Temple of Baal are being destroyed. So you'd be forgiven thinking then that ISIS have perceived the Western tourists who admire Palmyra ruins and US initiatives to preserve this heritage as the last vestiges of colonialism in Syria. De Cesare points out that Western archaeologists remained in Syria even after Syria gained independence, and also in many Middle Eastern countries, post-colonial nationalists continued colonial practices and discourses in archaeology. So it seems then that heritage and archaeology in Syria have almost become synonymous with colonialism. And this relates to Chatterjee's argument that that often countries shed colonialism to then just adopt its values later on. And so to truly be post-colonial means to remove all vestiges of colonialism. And it's possible to speculate that this is what ISIS are trying to do now when they destroy these Greco-Roman ruins. This is supported by an article in their magazine Debate. So in the same issue, which documented the destruction of the Temple of Baal, there's a separate article which discusses how Westerners have attempted to make this heritage into a Muslim identity. But the justification that they offer simply states that Baal was idolatrous, so they're just using religion as a justification. But it seems as though more is going on here due to this other article that was in the same issue. So I'm now going to move on to discuss how identity politics can be linked to the destruction of particular monuments of heritage. The ruins in Palmyra have also come to represent Assad's definition of the Syrian identity, thus relating to the sectarian nature of the conflict. In 2017, when Assad retook Palmyra, he framed himself as the civilized guardian of the city. And this idea of identity politics is also central to the current conflict in Syria. And the current conflict is based on two conflicting identities, one of which, the Alawi Shia Muslims, they support Assad's regime and they represent around 12% of the population. And the other identity is of the Sunni Muslims, who are represented by opposition parties and rebels, and they believe in this idea that Syria is an artificial state which was created by the West after World War I. And these two conflicting identities were epitomized by rival protests in 2011, where one protest showed one particular flag of Syria and another protest showed another flag of Syria. And it's important to remember that these identities did exist before 1920, when this artificial state of Syria was created, but they then became defined and politicized in tandem with the evolution of the so-called Syrian state. In 2012 as well, ethnically motivated murders were often based on these two different identities. This is a simplified reading of the conflict, but it does relate to the way in which the conflict is what we might call a new war. It's about issues of identity, and it's also an internal conflict. So it's interesting the populations who live locally to Palmyra are supportive of Assad's regime, and it relates to the idea, Cunliffe's argument, that ISIS have two audiences in mind when they destroy heritage, and Cunliffe suggests that although it might seem the main audience is international when they put content online, most spectacles of destruction are only seen by local communities, which is their main audience. This is supported by a UN article which discusses how ISIS forced communities who live near Palmyra to watch the destruction of funerary busts in order to break the bonds between people and their history. So they understand how important particular monuments are to local Syrians. And this relates to how Dante discusses the way there are networks of concerned citizens all over Syria trying to protect their heritage because it's so entwined with their own identity. We can see Palmyra as a palimpsest of identities. During its rich history, there have been communities of Jewish people and Christians, and it supported this idea of polytheism, so religious tolerance, and this is problematic for ISIS because they just want a one religion state without any religious tolerance. And it explains why they've destroyed other monuments as well, like the Tomb of Jonah in Mosul, Iraq, which is symbolic of religious tolerance, and it was frequently visited by Jews and Christians alike. And it also can be associated with geopolitical tensions as well. So ISIS have recently made threats towards Israel and America, which both represent Jewish and Christian communities. So I think this shows how religious and political layers of the so-called iconoclasm are very much intertwined. Yes, this is about religion, but it's also about politics as well. So when ISIS destroy ancient sites like Palmyra, they destroy any opposition to their own identity, erasing tangible heritage in order to construct cities in their own image. I think it's important then to move on to think about solutions in terms of an appropriate international response. And this is why I've been looking at ideological reasons behind the destruction, because I really think that these can help to formulate an appropriate international response. So far, responses have been inappropriate, and a key example of this was in 2016 when in London one of the monuments which was destroyed in Syria was virtually recreated and displayed in the centre of London. And When the monument was unveiled, the then London Mayor, Boris Johnson, talked about how this represented so-called London values, and he framed ISIS as barbarians and also called them neo-medieval. So it's this narrative of civilization versus barbarianism, which really reminds me of 19th century imperialistic language, which will then only fuel more hatred towards the West and the way in which they've tried to impose concepts on countries and influence them. There's also been issues with the media attention which has been attributed to the destruction of heritage. And this has led to accusations of hypocrisy in two ways. So one way is the fact that it detracts attention away from human suffering, and as Barry argues, it leads to accusations of moral bankruptcy. It ignores the extent of suffering in places like Syria and Yemen. And also it's hypocritical because it ignores how most monuments of heritage destroyed by ISIS were of Shia heritage. There were Shia mosques and shrines. Dante points out that 9% of the heritage destroyed by ISIS was Shia. So as you can see, this image shows the destruction of a Shia mosque in Nineveh, Iraq. De Cesare, though, goes further than to criticise the media and Western governments, and she feels that UNESCO's response has also been inadequate because they used the phrase cultural cleansing to describe the destruction of heritage. But she felt that this detracted again away from the human suffering, and that the murders of 2012 were perhaps a much more devastating manifestation of cultural cleansing. And also, ISIS reject the liberal and secular values of UNESCO, and they even mocked the way that UNESCO described the destruction of heritage as a war crime. And it begs the question, is it helpful for UNESCO to be openly involved in the context of Syria? I think it's also important to remember that we need an appropriate international response because ISIS propaganda is effective. Their online material receives thousands of retweets, if not more, around the world, and their official magazine, Dabiq, is intended at a Western audience. It's written in English. And with their propaganda, they aim to entice potential recruits. And so an inappropriate response towards destruction of heritage will just fuel more propaganda towards the West, especially if hypocritical imperialist language is being used, and it will in turn just strengthen ISIS war efforts potentially. So this is why we need to be so thoughtful in terms of how we respond. In 2017, when ISIS captured Palmyra for the second time, they also went back to destroy a Roman amphitheatre and the Tetrapylon. So these two monuments represented, again, two of the most ancient monuments in Palmyra. They said that their incentive was to destroy religious opposition, again, a very simplified motive, but this again attracted global media attention. So what would a more appropriate international response look like? Bauer convincingly argues that it would combine efforts to preserve lives with efforts to preserve heritage. and it would be careful in the way it frames heritage destruction without using these antagonistic, unhelpful narratives like civilizations as barbarian. And it would focus on framing this as basic freedoms for Syrians. This is why we're preserving the heritage for the Syrian people to help them rebuild after the conflict. I would add that there also needs to be more research on the part of international governments and organisations in order to prevent future destruction. In conclusion then, when we use unhelpful language, it just serves to underestimate ISIS motivations in terms of the destruction of heritage. We can't just take their justification as value. Yes, this is about religion, but it's also about historical issues and also political issues as well. And it's not helpful to just use terms like iconoclasm as a kind of umbrella term to describe and explain the violence. So it's crucial that we formulate better responses that don't just risk inadvertently validating ISIS hatred of the West through, as I said, the language that we use. Future responses then need to be low-key. They need to focus on supporting the Syrian initiatives to preserve heritage, which I've mentioned already, and we should avoid intervening on our own behalf just because these monuments are precious to us and attributing excessive media attention to particular monuments. These factors risk exacerbating tensions on both a national and international level. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it.